Ready?
Yeah, ready.
All right. Assalamualaikum, everyone. Welcome back to our Wellness Tuesday sessions. It's good to have Sheikh Yassir with us again. Thank you, Sheikh Yassir, for joining us. Um, just as a reminder, if this is your first time joining us, we're going to be doing weekly sessions on mental and emotional wellness, just to support our community through this difficult time and just prepare for any mental and emotional hardships that may arise. Today's topic is going to be suicide awareness. September is Suicide Awareness Month, so we just wanted to commemorate that and bring awareness to this really important and heavy topic that we normally don't talk about in our community. So Sheikh Yassir is going to lead us through the session, and then at the end we'll dedicate 10 to 15 minutes, maybe more, depending on how many questions we get, to just answer all of your questions that you may have. We'd also just like to remind you all that Sheikh Yassir does provide one-on-one emotional wellness consultations through the MAPS MCRC Community Health Clinic every Monday from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. And I'll include a link to schedule a session, to schedule the sessions or any other appointments with our clinic. Additionally, I'll be putting a Google form for you all to ask any questions that you have. And then again, all of the questions will be anonymous and we'll spend the last 10 to 15 minutes going over it. All right, with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Sheikh Yassir. Thank you again for joining us, Sheikh.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum to you, Nihat, and all the people who've decided to join us this evening and not watch the debate. So I'm grateful for your presence here with us. Appreciate this, inshallah, and it's good to see you again. And interestingly, just reminding our viewers as to what it is that we hope to accomplish as we're discussing these mindful or wellness Tuesdays. Really, the hope is to accomplish four things. We really do want to fight stigma. We want to educate the public about mental health and mental health related issues. We want to give support to those who are facing mental health problems and their loved ones. And finally, we want to create activities. We want to promote policies that actually help people who are going through mental health related issues and help their loved ones as well. And I think that, like you said, Nihat, the sad part is that a lot of these topics are stigmatized in our community, and we don't speak about them as much as we really should be doing. And a great part of this actually is caused by stigma, and just appreciating stigma before we go on with our topic for the day. And again, I apologize. I know that some of us have had experiences with losing a loved one to suicide. So if you are that person, if you're listening to this and you need to take care of yourself, please make sure that you do that. Okay. So stigma, when we speak about stigma, we're talking about a very powerful social source which allows one group of people to exclude or discriminate against another group of people. And the problem with the stigma is usually it is associated with disgrace and shame. And the impact of stigma on individuals and their families, people who have mental health issues or they have loved ones who have mental health related issues, it does so much to them. But number one, and the biggest one, is it lowers people's motivation to seek professional help. Nobody wants to do that. Because then what am I going to do? Seek help? And when people ask as to why, I am going to mention something that is either deemed to be shameful or it would bring me disgrace. So people's motivation to seek professional help is absolutely lowered because of stigma. Not only that, but it also results in self-stigma or the individual feeling ashamed of needing help. I have had so many people calling me saying, Sheikh, can you please talk to my wife, my husband, my brother, my sister, a family member? Please tell us what to do. And I say, look, they really need to see a professional. And what they tell me is they are so ashamed that the individual themselves, they know that they need help, but there is no way that they are going to seek help. Also, part of the impact of stigma is that it lowers the individual's self esteem. It discourages them from seeking treatment. And unfortunately, because of this, it also lowers their chances for recovery. And that is really what we are hoping to do. I have heard the other day we were having a session on parents who have special needs children. And I was told that sometimes the individual's family may hide their struggles with mental disorder, fearing the negative judgment of the community. So now we are looking at shame, we are looking at disgrace, we are looking at self stigma, we are looking at people's lower motivation to seek help, which in turn is also going to lower their chances of recovery. And as a result, now the individual does not get the help, and also the family, the loved ones also do not get the help or the support that they can be making use of. And that's why it's very important that we ought to eliminate stigma of mental illness. Because when we do that, I believe that we will help people. We will help the people who are going through this. We will also help their loved ones, and we will make their chances of recovery much, much easier. And again, the way to do this is very simple. Number one is please do not use stigmatizing language, especially when they are religiously motivated. And if you remember, we had a talk on when bad theology leads to bad psychology. The idea that every mental illness is either a punishment from God, that is unacceptable. Not every mental illness is caused by the possessions of the demons. No, mental illness is not caused by your, low iman, or what, your trust in God is not as good as it ought to be. These are very, very stigmatizing language, and we refer to this as blame the victim theology. Number two, we want to learn and recognize signs and symptoms of different disorders. As we are doing right now, we want to educate each other about negative impact of the stigma. And what I love about what we are doing is we are not afraid of talking about these issues. We're really bringing it up to the attention of the community and say, look, yeah, I appreciate the fact that we're Muslims, I appreciate the fact that we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're trying to do our best. But because you are a Muslim does not mean that you are inherently protected against these things. And one of them is of course suicide. And just to get us started, as like, why are we talking about this? We thought that, what, Muslims don't commit suicide. Muslims are, what, people who are like, we know Allah, we need to we can just, we will fix it. We can just read more Quran, go to the masjid, do prayers, speak to the Imam, and these are all good things. But that is not how you take care of it. It's being reported to me, and subhanallah, subhanallah, I get a lot of questions. Almost, I want to say that I receive at least 2 to 3 phone calls regarding a suicide that was completed by a community member somewhere, in the States. And people just asking, how do we help the family? How do we do this? Also in the mortuary services, Muslims would call me from the mosque and they say, Sheikh, you know what, we just received this family, we're doing their burial services, but on the death certificate it says that it was death by suicide, and we don't know how to help the family. The family is not talking about it, the family is not saying anything about it. So we want to make sure that we actually do address these issues. And to give you an idea of how prevalent suicide is, it is the 10th leading cause of death around the world. We are talking about it being the third leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 24. That by itself, it just makes people very, very mad. Or to put it more precisely, it ought to make us very mad that why would somebody who is that young, why would somebody that young, be thinking of suicide or entertaining suicide? So we want to make sure that we actually do address these issues. And what I like to do is we will talk about suicide, we'll talk about some of the motivation to suicide, but also most important is that we want to make sure that we are correct about the terminology that we are using. And then we're going to talk about symptoms that we can spot. And then we also address, what can be done. Okay. And please remember that as you're thinking right now, we're not talking about just teens, we're not talking about tweens, we're talking about just this is something that has crossed all age groups, it has crossed all religious, ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic, educational, there are no barriers. It is just all about this. Okay. Unfortunately, there are 25 suicide attempts for every completion for our country as a whole. So every time somebody completes suicide, there were actually 25 that were attempted. And that's what I meant by saying that, what the terminology. So here's what we have. We have suicide. What do we mean when we say suicide? We're talking about somebody intentionally taking their own life. We're not talking about accidental. They were not trying to harm themselves. No, they really intended to take their own life, bring their life to an end. When that is done, we would refer to it as suicide was completed. Um, some people don't like the word committed because committed makes it sound like it was a crime. And inshallah, as we are learning, we want to make sure that we get our language better. So we would say that suicide was completed. So that is suicide, intentionally taken one's life. And then there is what we call suicide act or gestures. These are actions that were done to deliberately injure one's self or attempt to injure oneself without resulting in death. So the person was acting upon that, they attempted to do that, but it was not completed. So we would refer to it as somebody attempted. So when I said that for everyone completed suicide, 25 others were attempted. What does that look like? Somebody swallowed a lot of pills. Somebody shot themselves. Somebody tried to hang themselves. Somebody tried to consume poison. So 25 people attempted, but only one succeeded. So for everyone completed suicide, 25 others were attempted. Then there is what we call suicide behavior. And these are the thoughts, the plans, or the actions which, if implemented, they could possibly result in death. So, as a clinician, for example, when people come to me and they're talking about them feeling very depressed, one of the questions that I ask is, have you thought about suicide? So that's just me seeing, did they entertain the thought? And people would say, yes, I have thought about suicide before. All right, I would say that, have you attempted suicide before? Meaning that did you take action to bring your life to an end? And people can either say yes or no. If they say yes, I must immediately ask them, are you thinking of suicide right now as you're talking to me? And if the answer is yes, then I would have to ask and say, do you have a plan? And if they say yes, like when I leave tonight, I am thinking of doing one, two, and three, then at that point, I must report. I must call family members. I must ask about the kind of social support that they have. And if need be, I can also call the police. I can call 911 and we report it as a 5150, meaning that this is a person who is in danger to themselves. So just to wrap it up really quickly. Suicide, intentionally taking oneself. Suicide act or gesture. Actions, if done, implemented, they can result in a person potentially taking their own life away. Suicide behavior are the thoughts, the plans, the ideations, or actions, if implemented, they could result in death. And then we have prevention. Of course, these are the things that we do, like right now, in order to prevent that. And then unfortunately, we also have postvention, and that is an intervention after a suicide, be it for students, for community members, or for the, excuse me, for the people, co-workers, or whatever the case may be. Between, not in the past 10 years, between 2010 to 2020, But between 2002, 2009, about 33,000 Americans died each year by suicide. Now, 8 million people, 8 million adults reported serious thoughts of suicides, and yes, they include Muslim community members. Out of the 8 million, 2.3 million people reported making a plan. And check this out, 1.1 million made an actual attempt. That is really, really, really crazy. And that is the sad part. Some myths about suicide. Some people would say, good life circumstances prevent suicide. And I tell you what, this is such a big, huge myth. I remember when Robin Williams committed suicide. I think it was back in 2014. And I remember I gave a khutbah about that. And one of the things was, look, this is somebody who's very popular, they're very famous. This is somebody who's very rich by virtue of what they did and what they were doing. And of all things, this was a comedian. This is somebody that made people laugh. And if we were to take a poll and ask people if you've ever watched Mrs. Doubtfire, most people would say, yeah, I've seen it so many times. I've seen it with my kids. It's an annual tradition in our family. We love Mrs. Doubtfire. We always watch Mrs. Doubtfire. And what happens is you come to people and you say, look, man, good life circumstances do not necessarily prevent suicide, because there are many people out there who are suffering in silence. That is what stigma does. What stigma does is that it literally pushes people to suffer in silence. Another myth that people have, people who want to do it just do it, they don't talk about it. And again, I tell you, this is such a big, huge myth. They found out that 80% of the people who've actually completed a suicide, prior to them completing a suicide, they've actually either spoken about it, they have written about it, or they made some kind of gestures, or they displayed signs that they were actually entertaining it. Okay. There was a study that was done about 229 completed youth suicides. So what they did is, unfortunately, 229 people took their own lives away. People went and they looked back and they studied. And what they found out is that 62% of these young people have actually made a suicidal statement. So now I say, whoa, what was going on? So why did people miss these statements? And hopefully, again, this is what we are hoping to address here this evening, inshallah. Okay. Another one is people who make superficial cuts across their wrist or make non-lethal attempts only want attention. And because you have seen one case, it does not mean that every single case is going to be like this one. And even if people wanted attention, that would be a very intense, drastic way of getting the attention. Why would somebody hard? Like, why are they not heard? So we want to make sure that, look, when people make these types of gestures or cuts, we want to take them serious. Okay. Here is the other one. That's a really big kicker, and it's a very common myth. And some people may even be critical of me right now as we're doing this. Here's what they say. They say talking about suicide with people who are upset will put the idea in their head. People, that is so not true. That is so not true. The opposite is actually the same. The opposite is actually correct. Because I spoke to somebody about suicide and I inquired whether they are suicidal or not, that does not put an idea in their head. If the idea is in their head, it's on their head on their own. Me bringing it up does not give people ideas. So what happens is that if you, and we will learn about some of these symptoms, if you see these symptoms, we want to make sure that you actually have the courage and the transparency of asking people, look, what you're telling me is very serious, what you're going through, how you're feeling, 1, 2, and 3, and say, look, I want I want to ask, is this something that you're entertaining? Another one, inshallah, just I want to make sure that we get into the topic, but I want us to destigmatize what is going on. Another issue or another myth that also people have is this idea of people who are depressed, they don't have the energy to kill themselves. Again, some of these myths, and with all due respect to people out there, they're just too ridiculous to even mention as, do people really believe that? Unfortunately, yes, they do. Some people really, really believe that. They believe that if you are, if you are depressed, then chances are you're just too tired anyways to kill yourself. And that is not true. And here is a point where I really, really want our viewers to pay attention to. 80% of the people who have committed or completed suicide, they did so because of an untreated or an undiagnosed mental illness. Let that just sink in for a second. 80% of the people who have completed the suicide, they did so either because of an undiagnosed or an untreated mental illness. Of course, the most common one is depression. That's 80% of the people do so because of an undiagnosed or an untreated mental illness. I think it would be very important that we become aware. It's like, what are we talking about? How do I pick on these things? How is it that I can see this. I really want to see that. And please remember also, we're talking about young people. We're not talking about adults. We're talking about just young people as well. Remember what we said, even though it is the 11th leading cause of death, over all the population, but remember it is the third leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 24. So we really, really want to address this idea. Okay. So what is going on? Okay. We are looking at who is at risk for suicide, meaning that what are some of the risk factors that if they are found, we would say this individual is at a higher risk of attempting or completing suicide more than other people. Number one, mental disorders, particularly mood disorders or eating disorders. Mood disorders, anxiety and depression, bipolar, and the others. And the most important one, of course, is depression. And very quickly, just as a recap, we're talking about symptoms of a person, just generally speaking, feeling down most of the time. A person who has lost interest in things that they found to be or they've enjoyed or found to be interesting in the past. Disturbance in sleep or eating habits, either sleeping too much or sleeping too little. They are either losing weight rapidly or they're just gaining weight. They're sleeping too much or they're sleeping too little. An energy that is just mostly down, very lethargic, shoulders down, and so on. Loss of hope, for example. Speaking about death, very important also is this idea of irritability, very easily irritated. And please, 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 again, please do not psychoanalyze your family members. We're just talking about the symptoms of depression at this point. So recognizing these symptoms. We're talking about a person's memory is really poor. We're talking about ability to concentrate is really poor. We're talking about a person's academic. They are not doing good in their academics or in their profession. They are socially isolated. We're talking about somebody who's not doing well in their profession. So when these symptoms or the majority of these symptoms are present, and they're present for a period of more than 2 weeks, and there is actually no explanation for it, such as what you call it, a life-changing event, then we would really want to say, look, what is going on amongst teens and adolescents. I just want to add a little more points to that as well, so that we are clear. extreme sensitivity to rejection or failure. That's a big one that teenagers actually exhibit. A sense of low self-esteem and feelings of guilt. Frequent complaints about physical illnesses such as headaches and stomach aches, and because sometimes people just find it easier to speak about their physical pain than they're speaking about their emotional pain. Frequent absence from school or poor performance in school, or sometimes kids, they get to that point of apathy, they just really don't care. Threats about running away or attempting to run away from home, that's a big one amongst teenagers. And like I said, the whole idea of just feeling sad, blue, irritable, and complaints that nothing is fun anymore, trouble sleeping, low energy, poor appetite, trouble concentrating. And then unfortunately also, when a person does not really take care of themselves, they're grooming, they're not paying attention to their personal hygiene. We say, look, this person is really, really depressed. Now, remember this, because a person is depressed does not necessarily mean that they are suicidal. But what we want to do is, because they are depressed, we want to speak to them about suicide. Okay. And that is really what we are attempting to do here. And remember, it is about recognizing the factors and also demystifying and destigmatizing what is going on, and also addressing some of the myths. Another one I think which is important, this whole idea of only insane people commit suicide. That is not true. People who commit suicide may feel hopeless, depressed, but they have not necessarily lost touch with reality, because that's what we mean when we say that a person is insane, meaning that they have lost touch with reality. People who are depressed, people who are hopeless, are not necessarily people who have lost touch with reality, but to the contrary, these are people who may just find reality too painful to bear on their own. So you don't want to believe that myth, in addition to the other myths that we brought up. Also focusing on teens, or including teens in the conversation, because some people believe that suicide is a problem among old people, not young people. Now, on the surface, this one may make sense, because like teenagers, man, that's like a fun time. People are learning to drive. They're in high school. They have friends. They've got all the video games. They've got all the gadgets that we never had. And why would anybody be entertaining something like this? And say, remember, it is a problem amongst the elderly, but remember that um, in the past 30 years, suicide for ages between 15 and 24, they've actually tripled. It is the third leading cause of death for people between 15 and 24. Okay. So now what happens is that we want to make sure that we actually include teens and adolescents um, in our conversation, in our conversation as well. All right. So we're talking about depression being one of the most common um, factors as to why people are at a higher risk, than people who are not depressed, for example. So we want to make sure that as we are addressing this idea of who is at risk, we say that people who have mental health disorder, especially mood disorders, they are at a high they are at a higher risk. Okay, or eating disorders. I'm not sure if we discussed eating disorders in our Tuesday, Wellness Tuesdays here, but inshallah one day we will. But these are people that we want to also keep in mind as well. Substance abuse disorders. People who abuse, consume substance they are also at a higher risk. If you remember the study that was done on the 229 people or youth, young people that were studied, I said that 62% of them, they have made a suicidal statement. Well, here is what they found out. They found out of the 229 people, almost 50%, 45%, they had consumed alcohol within 12 hours of killing themselves. So now they're seeing this relationship, and also spoken about poor academic performance. Out of the 229 youth that completed suicide, 76% of them had actually shown a decline in academic performance in the year before. So remember, we're talking about recognizing depression. Okay. um, Alcoholics have a suicide rate 50 times higher than the general population. So we just want to keep that in mind as we're speaking about who is at risk. People who have mental health disorders, particularly mood, particularly depression. And then we're talking about substance abuse disorders. And then the third risk factor that we also want to address is family history of suicide. Unfortunately, when a loved one has actually taken their own life and you come to know about it, unfortunately, to some people, that puts them at a higher risk since, unfortunately, a loved one has done it before. So usually when we do our assessment for our clients, we say, now, has anybody in your family done that before? And if the answer is yes, then we would say that that puts you at a high risk. Please keep in mind, we're not saying that because somebody in your family did it, you are going to do it. But we're saying that if somebody in the family has done it, then that puts other people at a higher risk. Hopelessness is a big one. The more hopeless the person becomes, the more likely they are, unfortunately, well, that just puts them at a higher risk. Also, a higher risk is for people who are impulsive and or they have aggressive tendencies. That puts them at a higher risk as well. The last two are really, really important. People are at a higher risk of suicide because there are barriers to accessing mental health treatment. And I really, really want us to spend time on this. Remember what we were saying about stigma? Because what stigma does is that it forces people to suffer in silence. We're saying that what stigma does is that it literally prevents people from reaching out for help. And now, what we want to reiterate and emphasize on is people are at a higher risk of committing suicide because they do not have access and there are barriers to them getting mental health help, like seeking professional help. And that is usually, unfortunately, due to the stigma that we spoke about earlier. I remember I once had a client, a really, really sweet member in our community, really dedicated parent. And, his daughter came in and she told him that, she is depressed. And what the father did is that he slammed the door, the table and said, depression is not a word that we use in our family. What the father meant is that our family is a good family. There should be no reason for members of our family to feel um, depressed. And unfortunately for that young girl, she ended up cutting herself because there was just no way out. Inshallah, one day we may end up speaking about this. Okay, but the important part here is that barriers to accessing mental health treatment actually puts people at a higher risk for suicide. Divorced parents or poor family communication, that also puts people at a higher suicide risk, or it is seen as a suicide risk factor. Please remember, we're not saying that because your parents are divorced, you're going to do this. We're not saying that because your family has poor communication. No. Remember, we're saying is that there are many factors, and when we are assessing what is going on, it seems like there is a common theme that people who have completed suicide have gone through. So we look back and we study them, and we find out there are these things that they have in common, and that is why we're speaking about them. We're just saying, look, if that is the case, then we want to make sure that the people are actually aware of it, and that people become aware of these things. Other issues also that would put a person at a risk is relational, social, work, or financial loss. People who've studied, what the Great Depression that happened in the early 1900s. People just lost money, and they just did not know how to bear the loss. So that loss may actually push people into completing suicide. Physical illness, that is also a big one. People are just in a lot of pain with, especially with euthanasia. It is becoming legal in different parts of, I think, in a couple European countries. That is also the case. Another also risk factor may be previous suicide acts. Remember what we said at the very beginning, that people sometimes complete suicide. People have suicidal acts or gestures. These are people who have attempted to take their own life. It resulted in injury, but not necessarily in the completion of the suicide. So a person who has had personal history, there are two types of history: family history, and then there is the individual themselves. They've attempted this before. The fact that they have done it before, they've attempted it before, that also puts them at a risk as well. Okay. Unfortunately, also easy access to lethal methods, especially guns, that puts people at a higher risk since they have a way of actually doing it. We're talking about age, culture, and lack of connectedness. People, this is really important, especially for our communities that have a big refugee. If your state, your city is a resettlement city, for example, people come in, and yes, they did leave, their back home areas hoping for a better life, but they come here and they are faced with a cultural gaps, cultural barriers, the idea of not speaking the same language, the idea that they're a bit older, and they're homesick, and they don't have any support, lack of connectedness. That just puts people at a higher risk of completing suicide. Unfortunately, I was told of a young man who just recently moved to the States, and he was just socially isolated, didn't really know many people and what have you. And about, a few months ago, I was called and said, that young man actually took his own life away. So what we want to do is that we want to make sure that we are aware of these signs. Of course, talking about feelings worthless or feeling helpless. Sometimes also we want to pay attention to people just out of nowhere visiting or calling people to say goodbye. When you study these 229 people and their likes, what we find out is that they've made a lot of hints. They gave hints, but people just did not put two and two together. So they would give away some stuff that was very dear to them, very valuable. Hey, can you take care of my pet when I can you please take care of my pet? Why? What are you doing? I just want to make sure that it has a good person that will take care of it. Why? Why are you doing this? People start giving away their valuables. They start calling people, saying goodbyes. It's not that they're traveling, they're not going anywhere, they're not leaving the state, they're not going away for schooling. The other person is not leaving, they're not going anywhere. People just out of nowhere said, I just called to say goodbye. Why? Where are you going? Inshallah, it will all be better. Well, no, wait a minute. What's going on? What's happening? This type of language, we want to make sure that we pick on. I remember. Oh, I think I told you. Remember the 62% of the 229 people that were studied, they actually made a note. They also found that overall, 80% of the people, they've actually give out hints that they are going, and they reach out. It's like almost like, the last thing that they want to do. um, Before I leave, I want to make sure that I straighten everything that that I that I have, or that I have done. Okay. Please pay attention to statements of hopelessness, such as, there is no point in going on, I can't take it anymore, I have nothing left to live for, I can't stop the pain, I can't live without, my life keeps getting worse and worse, I might as well just kill myself. So these are all statements that indicate hopelessness. Remember, not every statement is going to result in suicide, but we really want to inquire as to what is going on. Okay, so if that is the case, then we want to make sure that we actually become aware of these things, and then we want to take actions, and we want to be able to offer help, such as what people say that, well, but if I find out that somebody is entertaining suicide, what do I do? And what can I say? What can I say to them? And here are, three statements that you can say. Number one, you can say, I am glad you told me. I want to help. I remember one time, I think it was like right after Fajr, um, I had somebody just called me, and I picked up the phone, and it was like really, really early in the morning, like really early in the morning. I picked up the phone, I say, hello, assalamu alaikum, alaikum salam. Somebody I did not know, it was a young girl. The first thing that she said is, I need help. And I remember, and I can really, really, just showing really gratitude for my training. It was really early in the morning, and the very first thing that she uttered is, I need help. And I remember that day I immediately said, I am glad you called. I am glad you called. So I could have said, or unfortunately, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, it's a girl, do you know what time it is? Can this wait? Is this an emergency? When somebody does that, they really are very desperate. So when they call and they say, I need help, we want to make sure that we accommodate. I am glad you called. I am glad you told me. I want to help. I'm glad you told me, and I'm going to find somebody to help you. I will stay with you until help arrives. Okay, but the idea of, I'm glad you're sharing this with me. I am glad you told me. So you said, man, why are you calling me, man? It's like, you could have called somebody else. Like, why are you making this my issue? The immediately is, we just want to make sure that we accommodate the person. And we immediately, what we want to do is that we want to create a safe place for the person to continue talking to us. Remember, the longer you keep the conversation, the longer you keep them on the phone, the more you allow them to open up, the better it will be. And I know you showing up means that, you know what, I've spoken too much. So I'm just going to wrap it up very quickly. So we're talking about, what else we can do. These are the things that you can say. What not to say. Here are statements that you never want to say. Oh, it's just a phase. Please don't say that. Do not say, you will snap out of it. That is not something that you want to say. Stop being selfish. Don't say that. You're just trying to get attention. Do not say that. Get over it. Do not make these statements. Do not say that. Okay? Or do not allow them to do the following. Do not let them bargain you out of getting them help. You know what? It's okay. I'll just call somebody else. And no, don't allow this to happen. So I had one time, I had somebody, and they were telling me that they were really, really thinking of suicide. So I said, okay, I had to have their consent. Their consent is good to have, but at that point, it's not a must. So I said, do me a favor. I'm going to call your parents. I'm going to stay on the phone with you. I want you to call me every 5 minutes as you're driving. Your parents are now aware. So until you make it home, both of us are are going to be calling you interchangeably. And then I made sure that, can I trust you that you will make it home? And when I got that, we will do that. But we definitely want to make sure that, oh, please just don't tell my parents about it. Don't tell my friends. I will get over it. No, when you share with me that you actually have a thought and you have a plan, at that point, I really do need to get as much social support as possible. Okay, so we want to make sure that we actually do, um, not allow them to bargain themselves out of that. Okay. And so these are some of the things that I really believe that, and it's not really enough to cover the point, but please remember that we actually, do want to help. So just to wrap it up really, really as neatly as I can, think of SAFE. When you think of suicide, think of SAFE, SAFE, four acronyms. The S stands for see the signs, which is what we just did. We want you to see the signs. The A in SAFE stands for acknowledge the distress and assess for the severity of the impairment that the person is going through. The F is for find best response to de-escalate. I am glad you told me. I will get you the help. I will stay with you. We will get through this, and so on. So reassure and be emotionally supportive. E, SAFE. The E is encourage to seek professional help and support. And that can be calling the doctor, it can be calling family members, it can be, but we definitely just want to do that. So please, when you think of suicide, think of SAFE, SAFE. See the sign, acknowledge, find help, and encourage professional help and intervention. Nihat, it's back to you.
Thank you, Sheikh Yasser, for that. That was very thorough. And we don't have that many questions today. We have a couple, which I'll go through. But I also just want to be cognizant that it's almost Maghrib time here. So
Okay.
I want to let people go. Maybe right at 7.
Okay.
Um, okay, so the first question is, were there any incidents of suicide during the lifetime of the Prophet and the Sahaba? If there were, how did they deal with it?
Very good question. That's actually an interesting question, because remember, Islamically speaking, and we assumed it, and that is, that suicide is absolutely haram. And in the Quran, there is a verse, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا. It can be translated or understood in two ways. Do not kill each other. Indeed, Allah is most merciful. Or do not kill yourselves. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most merciful. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hadith, it was very explicit. He sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that whosoever poisons themselves in this life, their punishment in the hereafter is to continue to poison themselves. And he who hits himself cuts himself for the sake of bringing their life to an end, that is going to be their punishment in the hereafter as well. There was an incident, yes, during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of somebody who could not bear the physical pain in the battlefield, and what they did is that they took their own sword and they just killed themselves. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade for such behavior. In addition to that, also Muslim scholars, they speak about not praying, or for the local imam not to lead prayers over a person who's just committed suicide. Now remember, and I know that sometimes I get these questions a lot. You know what? We had a case of suicide, and the imam has refused to lead the prayers. And generally speaking, Imam An-Nawawi puts it nicely. He said that that person is still a Muslim despite the fact that they just completed suicide. We say that as a way of deterring the community members and just letting people know how serious of an offense that is, the Imam would not lead the prayers. However, provided that this person was not part of that 80% of the people who had a mental disorder. When people have had that mental disorder, we want to make sure that we pray for them, that we comfort their family members, we comfort their loved ones, we lead the prayers, and we sincerely pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives that person, because that person really was not in the right mental state when they took their own lives away.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. And then the last question, actually another question came in. So one of the last questions is and I think you covered this during your lecture, during the talk really well, but what should we as a Muslim community do to equip our imams and religious leaders in identifying indicators that someone is considering suicide?
And I tell you, these are things that I'm really, really passionate about. So there are two types of education. There is what we're doing right now, and that is public education, talking to our community members. And then there is what we call train the trainers. Imams are the first point of contact that most people come to. We're not doing well, let's talk to the imam. And what we're really hoping for is that we cannot overwhelm our imams and ask them for a lot. But what we want to have is that we want to equip our imams with the proper tools, trainings, for example, such as the imam can recognize these signs. They can speak about suicide. And I know that we have not been having our khutbahs, but in September, we want the imam to speak to the community about suicide, to let them know that it is safe to come and talk to him about suicide related issues and depression, to destigmatize this, and equip our imam so that the imam becomes the liaison, the ambassador between community members and the professionals. So please make sure that we equip our imams with the proper tools, that our imams become aware of the local resources. Where do I call? Who are the professionals in our communities, social support systems in our communities. Okay, so fine. I spoke to that sister and I said, please do 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Who's going to follow up with that sister? Who's going to be giving her the support? A family just lost a loved one to suicide. Who's going to offer support to the family? The enormous amount of guilt that the people are going to be going through. So we want to make sure that not just the imams, but collectively as a community, number one is create that safe place, destigmatize mental health, equip people with the proper tools, and making sure that the masjid is a place that welcomes people, their loved ones who are going through mental health related issues.
Inshallah. Yeah, it seems like it's going to take a lot of work for communities to put this in place, but inshallah it can be done.
Yep.
And then the last question before we end for the day is, what do you do when you want to talk to your therapist or doctor about having suicidal thoughts but are afraid of getting reported?
Oh, that's a really, really excellent question. So, yes. So, every time you visit a therapist, the therapist will let you know at the very beginning that whatever you share with him or her is confidential, unless I have your prior consent. So, I'll say, look, whatever you share with me is confidential, with the exception of harm to self, harm to others, child abuse, or elder abuse. If you mention to me any of these four things, I have to report. Okay. So now, a therapist will not report you for having suicidal thoughts. That is not reportable. Okay. So remember, we said if you just have thoughts, that is not reportable. If you have ideation, that is not reportable. It becomes reportable is if you have a plan and means to carry out the plan. That is reportable. So you say, I'm just thinking of ending it all. Say, what do you mean? Say, I'm just going to kill myself. How are you going to do that? I'm just going to go back home. I'm going to use my dad's gun. I'm just going to shoot myself. Now, you're not just saying this. No, I think I'm really going to do that. That is that is a plan. That is a thought. But that's not just a plan, but you also have the means to carry out that plan. That is reportable. Okay. So a therapist is not going to report you because you have a thought. A therapist will report if you have a plan and the ability to carry out that plan, that is reportable. But I hope that whoever is asking this question, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease your pain, Ya Rabbal Alameen. So whoever is asking this question, please do not let that stop you from seeing a therapist. Go to the therapist. Let them know that you've been entertaining suicide. Okay, like I said, a plan on its own will not get you reported. What will get you reported is if you have a plan and the means to, I'm sorry, a thought by itself will not get you reported, but a plan and the ability to carry out the plan will get you reported, but we do this for your own benefit. And by the way, reported does not necessarily mean calling the police. Reported can just be, okay, I need to let your parents know. I need to let your family know. I need somebody to come and pick you up. I need somebody to come pick you up and take you to the hospital. It's okay, we can call the ambulance. So it's not, you will not be in a legal trouble. The therapist will do this because they really want to offer you the best care that they can have, that they can.
Thank you, Sheikh Yassir. That was a very good explanation. I think there was a lot of fogginess around that whole aspect, because we know that as a therapist you're a mandatory reporter, but the circumstances around that. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and it was a good question. It was a really good question. I'm glad that person asked. And like I said, may Allah ease your pain, whoever you are and whatever problems you're going through.
So I think we can wrap up for today. Thank you, Sheikh Yassir, again for talking about such an important topic for the community. I think so. Next week's topic is slightly different. We're going to be talking about parent-child relationships. So that should, inshallah, be a very good topic and very timely, because everyone's stuck at home with their parents or their children because they're not going to school.
It was good being with you, Nihat, and thank you for starting this again. And just to wrap up, like you said, if any of our family members, loved ones out there, or any of our viewers are going through difficult times, may Allah ease your pain. If you've lost a loved one, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless their souls. And if any of us or our loved ones have lost the way, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring us back to His way, Ya Rabbil Alameen.
Yeah. Okay, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Yassir. I'll see you next week, inshallah.
Inshallah. You take care. All of our viewers, Assalamu alaikum.